In the blistering summer heat of 605 BC, when the dust of ancient Mesopotamia rolled across the plains like a restless spirit, the world held its breath as two colossal powers marched toward a single destiny. And in that era, when empires rose like mountains and collapsed like sand, the mighty king Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon rode at the head of his army, his chariot wheels cutting through the cracked earth like blades. While far on the western horizon, the legendary Pharaoh Necho II of Egypt advanced with an army forged in desert, fire and fed by centuries of conquest. Both rulers knowing that the fate of continents, trade routes and entire civilizations would be decided by the first clash of their spears. Babylon marched with bronze helmets shining beneath the brutal sun, shields decorated with lions roaring in gold, and soldiers chanting war hymns that thundered across the land, while Egypt approached with the steady rhythm of thousands of sandals beating the ground, their blue and gold banners fluttering like living flames, chariots lined with deadly archers, and elite Magi warriors moving with the silent confidence of men born for battle. And as the two great forces drew closer to the dusty battlefield of Carchemish, birds fled from the trembling earth. The river shuddered with the approach of giants, and the sky itself seemed to dim beneath the looming shadow of war. Nebuchadnezzar's commanders rode alongside him, warning of Egyptian numbers, but the Babylonian king stared ahead with eyes burning like forged iron, declaring that this battlefield would not be remembered for numbers but for destiny, while Necho II, standing tall on his gilded chariot, raised his hand toward the rising sun and vowed that Egypt's light would swallow the east once and for all. And the world seemed to split into two halves as the dust clouds of the armies collided, the roars of men echoing across the plain, the scent of sweat, metal, and sand mixing into the raw smell of coming death. And even the horses tensed as if aware that the clash approaching them would change the balance of the world. Priests of Egypt lifted their staffs toward the heavens, calling on Ra to bless the warriors, while Babylonian seers burned incense and whispered to Marduk, both sides pleading to their gods for victory. And as the first lines formed Babylonian infantry in tight formations like a wall of iron, Egyptian spearmen forming a deadly forest of sharpened tips, chariots poised like lightning bolts waiting to strike the battlefield vibrated with the silent anticipation of the first scream, the first broken shield, the first fall of a warrior whose death would signal the opening of the floodgates of war. And in that moment, as the wind swept across the field carrying whispers of forgotten kings and lost empires, Nebuchadnezzar lifted his sword high, sunlight reflecting off its edge like a comet's tail, and Necho II raised his spear, the golden tip shining like a star about to fall. And for one stretched heartbeat, all of ancient history seemed to pause as two kings, two worlds, two destinies stared at each other across the dusty expanse, knowing that only one would walk off this land victorious, only one would rule the ancient world, and only one name would be remembered as the conqueror of Carchemish. As the first rays of the sun stretched across the battlefield of Carchemish, the world beneath it erupted into a storm of chaos, fury and fate, and the great armies of Babylon and Egypt clashed with such violence that even the earth trembled beneath the weight of their ambitions. For the moment Nebuchadnezzar gave the order to advance, the Babylonian front line surged forward like a rolling wall of iron, shields locked tightly, spears extended, their disciplined formations slicing through the shifting dust clouds. While on the opposite side, Pharaoh Necho II unleashed his chariot squadrons, the bronze wheels spinning so fast they sparked against the stones, and the archers atop them rained volleys of arrows that darkened the sky like a swarm of black locusts, each arrow carrying a silent promise of death as Babylonian shields shook under the thunderous impact. And men shouted, grunted, fell, and rose again, driven by the raw primal instinct to survive, even as the world around them drowned in screams. The Babylonian archers responded in kind, drawing their bows with precision honed through years of endless war, sending arrows that whistled through the air like vengeful spirits, striking Egyptian charioteers, piercing horse armor, and embedding themselves deep into the ancient sands of Mesopotamia, while the Magi warriors, fierce, agile, and loyal to Egypt beyond death itself, charged into the fray with curved blades that flashed like strips of lightning, carving their way through Babylonian foot soldiers in a dance of blood and steel. And the battlefield began to pulse with a rhythm only war could create, a rhythm of clashing metal, breaking bones, shattering shields, and the choking dust that rose like a curtain over the dying sun. Nebuchadnezzar, watching from the ridge on his heavy war chariot, saw the dust, heard the screams, and felt the trembling pulse of the world beneath him. And with a fire burning in his chest, he signaled his elite immortals to advance. Thousands of soldiers armored in shimmering plates, their steps synchronized, their spears aligned, their resolve unshakable, and as they marched forward the ground seemed to shift under their command. For the immortals were the spearhead of Babylon's empire, the unbreakable wall that had crushed cities, burned fortresses, and turned kingdoms into memories. And now they moved against Egypt with a hunger sharpened by destiny itself. But Necho II, standing tall in his gilded chariot with the sun reflecting off his helmet like a crown of fire, was not a king who bowed to destiny, for he believed destiny bowed to him. And raising his arm, he released the order for the Egyptian reserves to strike the Babylonian flank. sending in thousands of trained infantry who hammered into the Babylonian sides like a tidal wave, and the formation that had seemed impossible to crack began to ripple under the sudden pressure. Yet Nebuchadnezzar responded instantly, commanding his cavalry to sweep around the flank with the force of a desert storm, and the battlefield turned into an ever-shifting maze of blood, strategy, and unrelenting violence as both kings tried to outmaneuver the other with every heartbeat. Dust rose in massive clouds that swallowed the horizon. Horses screamed as arrows pierced their hides, chariots overturned and crashed into piles of shattered wood and broken bodies. Spearmen thrust blindly into the haze, swords swung without faces, and the sun itself dimmed behind the swirling storm of war, casting an eerie twilight over the battlefield as though the heavens could no longer bear witness to the horror unfolding below. The riverside, once calm and glistening, became a graveyard of armor and bodies, its waters turning red as Babylonian soldiers tried to hold the line while Egyptian warriors pushed them back step by step, both sides slipping on blood-soaked mud, their hands trembling but refusing to release their weapons, their throats hoarse from shouting war cries taught by fathers long dead. And in the midst of this merciless chaos, the two kings watched, their minds racing with calculations, anger, pride, fear, and the heavy weight of history pressing down on their shoulders. For they knew that this was not just a battle but a reckoning, a final clash between two worlds that had grown too large to share the same sky. Babylonian siege units launched flaming boulders that arced across the battlefield like falling stars, smashing into Egyptian formations with bone-crushing force, sending men flying and chariots splintering apart, while Egyptian priests chanted spells of protection, raising shimmering veils of dust and smoke that shielded their warriors from volleys of arrows. And the battle became a storm of earth, fire, and ash as the ancient gods were invoked in desperation to save their chosen people. Yet even the gods seemed silent, watching with wary eyes as the fate of continents hung by a thread woven out of blood. The center lines began to collapse under the unbearable pressure, soldiers no longer fighting for kings but for breath, for life, for a chance to see another sunrise. Their hands slick with blood, their armor dented, their spirits stretched thin, but still they fought, pushing forward with the last fragments of strength left within their mortal bodies. And in those desperate moments, heroes were born and forgotten in seconds, their names lost to time even as their final screams echoed across the battlefield. Smoke curled upward, forming dark pillars that reached toward the heavens as if marking the battlefield as a cursed land. Horses collapsed on their sides, steam rising from their wounds, shields shattered like broken mirrors reflecting the fading light, swords snapped, spears cracked, and the air became thick with the metallic scent of blood, burnt flesh, and fear. And through it all, Nebuchadnezzar stood tall, refusing to allow the tide of war to slip from his grasp, his voice rising above the chaos like thunder as he shouted new orders, sending fresh waves of soldiers to reinforce the weakening center, while Necho, to refusing to yield even an inch, led his personal guard into the thick of the fighting, his presence alone igniting a surge of ferocity in his warriors who fought like lions defending their dying pride. But as the hours dragged on and the sky turned from gold to gray to a darkening red, a subtle shift began to ripple through the battlefield. Babylon's lines, though battered, held strong with iron discipline, while Egypt's formations, stretched thin and damaged by relentless waves of Babylonian infantry, began to falter under the weight of exhaustion, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the world witnessed the turning of the tide, the moment when years of Babylonian military drilling, strategy, and ferocity began to overpower the proud but strained Egyptian legions. Still, the Egyptians fought on, refusing to retreat, refusing to surrender, and Necho too roared for them to hold the line. But even kings could not halt the bleeding tide forever. For the Babylonian immortals pushed forward with machine-like precision, cutting through the wavering Egyptian ranks, carving a path of destruction in a final, unstoppable surge that shook the ground with every step. And as dust rose like a giant shroud over the dying battlefield, the echoes of clashing steel and desperate screams faded into the heavy, suffocating air of approaching doom, marking the moment when Egypt's fate began to crumble under the iron fists of Babylon, setting the stage for the final reckoning that would determine which king would walk off the battlefield as ruler of the ancient world. As the smoke thickened over the battlefield of Carchemish and the sun dipped behind the choking haze of dust and death, the world seemed to shrink into a single trembling heartbeat, a moment suspended between collapse and conquest. And in that suffocating twilight where the air itself tasted of iron and ash, both armies stood on the razor's edge of destiny, their bodies bruised, their spirits splintered, their weapons slick with the blood of comrades and enemies alike. And yet neither Babylon nor Egypt yielded, for the spirits of two kings, Nebuchadnezzar and Necho, too still burned like twin suns, refusing to die. Babylonian horns roared across the plain, low and thunderous, like the growls of ancient beasts awakened from millennia of slumber, and their sound rippled through the ranks of exhausted soldiers, pushing life into weary legs as the immortals pressed forward in a final surge, their spears glinting with a cold hunger for victory. While Egyptian war cries answered back with fierce defiance, the Magi warriors forming a tight ring around their pharaoh as the last of Egypt, as chariots rumbled to the front, wheels rattling like distant thunder. dust exploding beneath the hooves of horses that fought against exhaustion and terror but still pushed onward for the honor of their king. Nebuchadnezzar saw the shifting tides, saw Egypt's lines trembling but not yet broken, and with a roar that seemed too large for a mortal man, he drove his chariot straight into the raging heart of the battlefield. Babylonian banners whipping behind him like flames in a storm, and every soldier who saw their king carve through the chaos felt a surge of wild courage, a fire in their veins that pulled them back from the brink of collapse as they tightened their formations and pressed harder into the Egyptian ranks. And the field erupted with renewed violence, blades meeting blades, shields meeting spears, bodies colliding with the force of falling stars. Necho, too, witnessing the Babylonian king charging forward, refused to be overshadowed, refused to let history write him as anything less than a titan. And raising his golden spear, he plunged into battle with his elite guard at his heels, the flash of his armor cutting through the darkness like a beacon of defiance, his voice carrying across the field as he shouted for Egypt to rise from the ashes and strike with the wrath of the Nile and the Egyptians. Hearing their Pharaoh in the thick of death's maw unleashed a final desperate storm of fury, their chants shaking the crumbling ground, their blades swinging with the ferocity of men who had nothing left but the fire of dying pride. The final clash was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen, a cataclysm of bodies and steel. The front lines crashing into each other with bone-shattering force, the dying screaming beneath the feet of the living, arrows falling into the river like black rain, chariots flipping and splintering under the weight of collapsing horses, soldiers fighting blindly through smoke that clung to their skin like ghostly hands. And somewhere within that swirling vortex of death, the two kings drew closer to each other with every heartbeat, their armies circling them like storm winds closing around the eye of a hurricane. Babylonian cavalry swept a left flank, smashing into Egyptian infantry with the brutal momentum of a raging tempest, while the immortals on the right flank sliced through what remained of Egypt's spearmen, and the once mighty Egyptian formations began to buckle, their lines bending, faltering, crumbling as Babylon's relentless advance tightened around them like a crushing vice. And though the Egyptians fought with the desperation of lions cornered in a burning cave, the Babylonian wave swallowed them piece by piece, the battlefield shrinking under the weight of overwhelming force. But even as defeat coiled around him, Necho too refused to retreat, refused to abandon his warriors, refused to surrender his legacy to the rising star of Babylon. And in a moment that would echo through centuries of whispering historians, he charged toward Nebuchadnezzar in a straight blazing line, his spear raised, his voice slicing through the storm as he challenged the Babylonian king to face him not as conqueror and conquered but as man against man, destiny against destiny. And the soldiers on both sides felt the battlefield freeze as though time itself bowed to the confrontation. The two kings circling each other amidst the ruins of thousands of dreams, the dust settling around them like falling ash, the wind holding its breath. Nebuchadnezzar dismounted his chariot, stepping forward with sword drawn, his armor cracked and dented, his face streaked with dust and blood. Yet his eyes burned with unshaken fire as he faced the Pharaoh who had stood against him with the courage of a lion. And when their weapons met, the sound rang across the battlefield like a shattering star, a clash that sent sparks swirling through the dying light, their blades carving arcs in the smoky air as they fought with the last shreds of strength left in their bones. Each strike a thunderbolt, each movement a ripple through the fate of nations. The duel raged on, their weapons grinding, their boots sliding in mud darkened by blood, their breaths ragged but determined, until at last Nebuchadnezzar struck a blow that shattered the golden spear of Necho too, the fragments scattering across the ground like pieces of a fallen sun. And in the stunned silence that followed, the Pharaoh stumbled back, his guard rushing forward, but held at bay by a wall of Babylonian shields. And Nebuchadnezzar, sword poised for a final strike, paused in out of mercy, but out of recognition for a king who had dared to fight the world itself. He lowered his blade, allowing history to claim Necho to not as a defeated coward but as a warrior who fought until even destiny bowed to exhaustion. And as the Egyptian army collapsed and the Babylonian banners rose across the field, the world changed forever, the balance of power shifting like a breaking continent as Carchemish became the grave of Egypt's imperial dreams and the birthplace of Babylon's unstoppable rise. Smoke drifted across the broken plain, carrying the whispers of thousands of fallen souls into the fading sky. And as Nebuchadnezzar stood amid the ruins of war, the future of the ancient world stretched before him like an open throne. For on that day, on the day two kings fought for the world, only one emerged to shape the next age. And the echoes of that battle would thunder across history for thousands of years after the dust finally settled.